This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Yaakov Katz, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He previously served as the paper's military reporter and defense analyst. Mr. Katz joins us today to discuss his latest book, While Israel Slept: How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East, which examines the events leading up to October 7th, 2023. Stay with us as we speak with Yaakov Katz. Yaakov, welcome to NatSec Matters.
It's great to be with you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Well, Yaakov, I've been really happy to get to know you a little bit from your trips to the United States and coming to Israel. And I remember when I visited, you said you were working on a book on the intelligence failures surrounding October 7th, an issue I'm really interested in. Of course, here in the United States, we've had two catastrophic intelligence failures here of the last 20 years, which of course Iraq WMD and 9/11. And so I think it's really appropriate for us to talk about these issues because they're lessons for policymakers, intel analysts, and the rest. And so thank you for writing the book, and let's get into it. Kind of give us an overview of your book and tell us a little bit about where the Israeli people are. Do they feel like they know what happened, or are there demands for a larger inquiry into the failures surrounding October 7th?
Michael, first of all, it's great to be with you, and thanks for having me on the show, and really for your friendship over the last few years. I really appreciate it. You mentioned Iraq WMD, and of course 9/11. Israel has had its share of intelligence failures over the years. It's difficult to talk about the failures that led up to October 7th, which was almost 50 years to the day, to the first, or I would say the previous bloody debacle, and that also was a result of an intelligence failure, which was the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Israel was surprised on its holiest day by the Egyptians, by the Syrians, when they crossed in and invaded Israel in an attempt to win back the territory that they had lost just 6 years earlier in the Six-Day War. And also then, kind of in the Israeli psyche, was Yom Kippur came down as this idea or this event that was the result of hubris, of arrogance, of not appreciating the severity of the challenge and the threat, and basically falling asleep at the wheel. And when we look at October 7th, what we at least tried to do, my co-author Amir Buchbut and I, what we tried to do in the book was to look at not just the 36 hours, let's say, that led up to 6:29 in the morning on October 7th when Hamas's attack began. It began with, as people will remember, began with a massive rocket and missile assault, then with a smaller scale incursion by the, I would say, more elite of the Hamas forces known as the Nukhba forces, who crossed in and bogged down the military forces that were deployed along the border, attacked those frontline positions, cut the communications, cut the live kind of camera feed, fought with the soldiers in their bases. They wouldn't be able to deploy and try to defend the kibbutzim and the communities that were deployed, and made it just very difficult for Israel to understand what was happening. We wanted to go back to the creation of Hamas, basically in the 1980s, and understand what happened then, and maybe were there signs and events along the way that we can look back at now. Obviously, hindsight is a luxury, of course, when it comes to these issues, but to look back and say, okay, what did we know then, and what can we now say? We have to identify these things in the future so they will not be allowed to happen again. Because I think that ultimately what Israel suffers from, to some extent, is that we view ourselves in this country as a very Western people, a country whose cultural trade ties are with the United States or with Europe. We want to be a Western state, but unfortunately we're in a region where we're not in the West. We're in the thick of the Middle East. We're surrounded not by countries in Europe, but by Lebanon, a failed state with Hezbollah. We're surrounded by Syria now. Who knows what's going to happen there a year after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And of course, Hamas, which remains in power to some extent in Gaza. And as we look to the future, we definitely do need to really do a deep dive and understand and learn the lessons. Unfortunately, though, Michael, this whole issue of culpability, of accountability when it comes to October 7th, like your own government experience tells you, and you know this, gets caught up a lot of times in the politics of things.
Yeah, right.
And what we've seen is a lot of the military intelligence folks who have gone home over the last 2 years, but where we haven't seen any taking of responsibility is in the government. And there is definitely something of an attempt to try to keep the focus on the military, try to minimize what happened to a military failure, an intelligence failure, and not have to get into the questions of 1 second, whose policies might have led to this way of looking at Hamas, who was in charge that might have taken steps on a policy level that led to the IDF saying, you know what? Hamas might be training, Hamas might be arming, Hamas might be developing rockets, but it's all for show. It's all for, to flex a muscle, just to get more money or more economic benefits, but not really for war. And Israel right now is very much caught in that debate of whether we want a state commission of inquiry or, as the government would like to see happen, that they can establish the commission that will investigate themselves, which, as absurd as that might sound, that might be the direction that Israel is headed.
Well, President Bush fought the creation of the 9/11 Commission, which helped create it, ironically, because then people wanted it all the more. And then for Iraq WMD, he appointed his own independent commission, so things didn't get out of control and politicized, and it ended up working out, and it was a credible effort. But I know you all are going through all of this as well. Well, I want to get more into the politics of it, but let's, as you say, go backwards in time, not just to the immediate intelligence failures around that day, although I'd love to hear about them. Explain to us this idea of the concepcia and why Israel couldn't imagine that Hamas was going to come at them the way they did.
I want to just stick on that word that you just mentioned, imagine, or linger on that for a moment, because I really think that this was an issue of a lack of imagination. I think it was Donald Rumsfeld, the late Secretary of Defense, who spoke about 9/11 in the terms of it wasn't a shortage or lack of information. It was a lack of imagination of what's possible. And I think that Israel definitely also, to a large extent, had that similar situation, because we know, and as a reporter, I was seeing these videos that Hamas was putting out. We saw them training. We saw them building the mock bases of the IDF inside Gaza, simulating storming those bases, grabbing people, pulling them away is what they would do if they were to try to kidnap them. It was all pretty much known that they were training for these types of events. But Israel was stuck in that word, in the concepcia, in this paradigm, or was looking at it all through the specific prism. Concepcia is taken obviously from the English word concept, but it does, I don't think it does justice. It was more a prism through which it viewed everything that Hamas was doing. And the prism was the following, basically. And not all of it is wrong, by the way, Michael. And I think that's what makes this even more interesting is, if you look at where the policy of containment, how Israel said, look, we know Hamas is there. We know they're jihadists. We know they have ambitions to destroy and kill as many Israelis that they can. That's not a secret. We've been fighting wars with them every 2 years pretty much since Israel pulled out of Gaza in the summer of 2005. So it's not as if they came out of nowhere. Right. We knew they were there. We were fighting with them. But Israel said to itself, we have first, number one, bigger fish to fry. We have bigger issues. By the way, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was for a brief period between 2021 and 2022 in the opposition, he wrote an autobiography. And in it, he goes back to 2014 to when Israel fought a war against Hamas for 50 days. And he mentions some members who are currently in the opposition, Naftali Bennett, who wants to run against him in the next election, Avigdor Lieberman, who was the defense minister for a period of time. And he says, they wanted to push me into Gaza in a big way back in 2014. But I didn't want to do that because I understood we had Iran, we had Hezbollah, we had bigger threats. In other words, we have those, we got to stay focused on them. We can't divert resources. We can do the best we can with Gaza, but let's keep Hamas where it is. We don't have to allocate the resources, and we've seen what the last 2 years have meant for the military. How much of its personnel, how much of its forces does it have to put into Gaza to be able to really take on Hamas mainly because of the subterranean infrastructure that it has there, those hundreds of miles of tunnels. We don't want to do that because we have to deal with the bigger issues. So that he wrote that. He said that, and that was very much true. And I can't say he was wrong with that. Those were the bigger threats. And by the way, when we look at the success that Israel's had, everyone remembers the pager attack, but we look at against Hezbollah, the elimination of the top leadership of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, and his successor and his successor. Most recently, the number 2 guy in Hezbollah was killed in an Israeli strike in Beirut just a few weeks ago. Hezbollah was a major threat, and Israel had unbelievable intelligence and penetration of Hezbollah. Iran, we saw during the 12-day war what Israel was capable of doing in eliminating the scientific leadership, the military leadership, and in causing extensive damage to the missile capability, the air defense systems, and to the nuclear infrastructure. So when we were focused, we were good. When we weren't focused, like in the case of Hamas, look what happened. So that was issue number 1, and that's still very, very true. And I can't say that he was necessarily wrong. The second thing, though, that led to this policy and this prism was, I think, technology. Israel had developed over the years, everyone's familiar with Iron Dome. That's the rocket defense system that can literally intercept the rockets. So Hamas goes ahead and develops rockets, and then longer ranges. And then in the beginning, they can only strike near Gaza, a couple kilometers in. Now they're already capable of hitting in Tel Aviv. But Israel develops Iron Dome, and Iron Dome basically shoots them out of the sky. So we say to ourselves, 1 second, we have Iron Dome to eliminate the rocket threat. We have this amazing barrier along the border. They dig tunnels under the border. We dig a wall underground and a system that can detect when they're digging tunnels. We're safe. We're impenetrable. We don't have to worry about them infiltrating because we got it covered. Yeah. So that was, I would say, pillar number 2. Kind
of a false hope that technology would deliver you.
Correct. So that was I would say, I would call it pillar 2 to this conceptia. But then there's pillar 3. And pillar 3, to an extent, I think, much more controversial, much more political, was Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it's hard to not mention him a number of times because he has been the prime minister for the large part, 14 out of the 15 years leading up to October 7th. He believed, not that he wanted, God forbid, this attack to happen, not that he wanted Hamas to be strong and to be able to attack Israel, but he was not necessarily opposed to a situation that Hamas was in charge of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in charge of the West Bank, because that was the best reason and the best excuse why anyone who would come to Israel and say, hey, 2-state solution, open up with negotiations with the Palestinians, he would say, what are you talking about? We got the PA in the West Bank. We got Hamas in the Gaza Strip. What 2 states are you talking about? They don't even get along with one another. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing having Hamas in charge of the Gaza Strip. I think all of that together led to the creation of this prism. And what the prism was essentially when someone would come and then say, well, we see Hamas training, we see them preparing for war, they would say, no, that's not what they're doing. They just want more money. They want more workers coming into Israel. And by the way, it also has to be said, that was the message they were transmitting to Israel. They were saying to Israel, we don't want war. We want quiet.
We want economic development, right? Yes. Economic development. And that was part of the misconception as well, I think, right? That you assumed completely that they were not going to come at you militarily because they wanted to prosper economically.
100%. And also, I don't know if you remember, but there was a 2-day operation in the summer of 2022. They had already prepared their plans and they were ready. It was a question of now when to pull the trigger. In the summer of 2022, Israel launches an operation, I think it was called Breaking Dawn. That was the name that was given to it. It's almost from the Twilight book series or movie series. I think it's one of those names. And it was aimed just at the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, so PIJ, not against Hamas. And Israel is taking out these Islamic Jihad guys, is just attacking them. And it sees Hamas standing on the sidelines, literally, not engaging, not firing rockets, even telling its people, stand down, don't get involved. And that act, which we now know was an act of deception, reinforced the idea in Israel. Hamas doesn't want war. In other words, we can now even act against Islamic Jihad, and Hamas doesn't do anything. We now know that that was a deception. That was an attempt to put us into a deeper sleep and to actually believing this misconception and this and falling into the conceptia. But it was all aimed at getting Israel to believe that this is what Hamas genuinely wanted, when really it was getting ready for the largest assault ever and a war that would have essentially definitely change the Middle East, but maybe even change the world order to some extent over the last 2 years.
Yeah. So, it's worth just to spend one more minute on this. It is, Israel had intelligence that they were training. Israel had intelligence that there were tunnels and the like. Israel had intelligence, and I think had recovered, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but something about the actual plan for Hamas to go over. But the feeling that it was so remote because they were focused on other things was so strong, all of these little elements were dismissed. That's just extraordinary in retrospect that, and I think a lot of the intelligence failure literature calls it confirmation bias. This caused Israel to overlook almost everything, including up until the night before this happened.
100%. All of what you just outlined and spelled out was available, was open source intelligence to a large extent. None of this came as a big secret. But what I think happened here was that we had the belief that they didn't want war. We had the reliance on technology that we thought would keep us safe. And at the end, it's not as if we didn't have forces along the border. We did. We had a quite large deployment along the border on a regular basis. And the idea and the belief that if they were to try anything, and this is that lack of imagination that you mentioned, if they were to try anything, well, we'll stop them. They might get across a couple of people, but we'll be able to stop whatever's coming. No one imagined the magnitude. No one imagined the sophistication. No one imagined how they would do it. And it was sophisticated. It was old school. It was low tech, but it was very sophisticated. It was from the air. It was from the ground. It was from the sea. They knew the intelligence that they had gathered. Still, lots of it is coming out. There was just a report the other day of how Hamas had created teams of hundreds of people inside Gaza who would study social media accounts of Israeli soldiers, thousands of them, Facebook, Instagram mostly, TikTok, and would try to glean information from images and videos that soldiers would post online. And they apparently were able to discover almost something like a kill switch that existed inside the Merkava Mark IV tank. That's the Israeli, very sophisticated, very technological tank. Number of these deployed along the border. And they were able to neutralize some of these tanks when they attacked on October 7th.
That's extraordinary.
All of this, we did not know. I didn't know this, and we didn't know this when we wrote the book. What we did know writing the book already then, though, was that they had come into Israel with maps of the kibbutzim, who lives where, who has a dog, who has a golf cart, where's the elderly couple, who has potentially weapons in their house. They knew exactly in the bases what the soldiers would do once the rocket attack commenced, which rooms they would go into, where the safe areas were. They knew where the communication cables were in these frontline positions. They had amazing intelligence on Israel. And it was something that Israel was not aware of, the extent to which Hamas understood us, maybe better than we understood them.
Incredible. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Yaakov Katz.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, before we get to the specific intelligence failures, which I'm also interested in, including, failure to collect on walkie-talkies and the rest, can we talk about this Qatar angle? There's this, and I guess it's under the economic theme that you mentioned, but I think it's widely accepted that as a policy matter, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, not only looked the other way as Qatar supplied cash to Hamas, or at least in Gaza, ostensibly for the purposes of economic development, but actually supported it because it seemed to be the easiest way to placate the people there. Talk a little bit about that, and is that part of the reason why Netanyahu is opposing a commission of inquiry, because he's really deep in the policy calls that enabled Qatar to fund Hamas?
Well, let me start with the second part. I think 100% he knows what a commission of inquiry will find out. And he knows that they will show very quickly and very easily. I've seen the documents myself that were sent by people on his staff, whether it was the head of the Mossad under his direction, heads of the National Security Council, whether it was conversations that he had directly with the Americans and indirectly with the Qataris, asking them to facilitate these money transfers. Basically, in 2018, Netanyahu really wanted to try to find a way to create some quiet inside Gaza. And the Qataris had stepped up after that operation in 2014 that was called Protective Edge that I mentioned before, and they had started to send a lot of money to Gaza. Now, this had to do with the previous emir's attempt, I think, an effort to make themselves, and this is what we see, it's a known, I would say, trait of the Qataris, to make themselves indispensable and a player on the regional stage. So they saw that Gaza, there was no one there. No one was sending money in as aid. They were just after a big war. Let's give them some money to help them rebuild. And Qatar stepped up. Netanyahu saw that after a couple of years as an opportunity. And Israel and the Qataris always had a very, I would say, tenuous relationship, but it was also a lot of sharing of information and intelligence cooperation. It's not an enemy state to Israel, Qatar. And therefore, Israel always was going there. There was even a trade office that Israel had in that country after the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. It was shut down in the beginning of the Second Intifada, which erupted in 2000. But these ties go back, and they date back decades. So Netanyahu asked them, would you be open to the possibility of sending money to Hamas? And Hamas wanted the money. It was also a way, because let's remember that in 2018, the Palestinian Authority was trying to choke Hamas. It had decided to stop paying the salaries. Abu Mazen in the West Bank decided to stop paying the salaries of Palestinians inside Gaza. That even though the Palestinian Authority was not inside Gaza, it still kept something of control over the place, because it was the money that was sent to the Palestinians went through the PA in Ramallah. And if the PA didn't send those salaries to Gaza, then you'd have a lot of people who would be angry and upset, and a lot of mouths to feed that they wouldn't have the money. Who would they turn their anger against? They could turn it against the PA, but the PA is not there. So they turn it against Hamas. And they were really desperate for cash. Netanyahu saw this as an opportunity. Let's get the Qataris, bring them in to Gaza, get them to send money to Gaza. Let's also remember another thing about 2018. Qatar had been, I would say, basically sidelined, ostracized, attacked by a lot of the Gulf countries and Egypt and Jordan. Al Jazeera was being banned and boycotted from different Arab countries. They were cutting off ties with the Qataris because of their support of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Qataris were a little on the ropes. They were looking for something of a salvation and an opportunity to kind of re-up and improve their international brand and to get some sort of opportunity to play in the big leagues. They got it with Gaza. So they jumped at the opportunity. What's $30 million a month that they send into Gaza for them? What's $360 million a year? That's chump change for the Qatari government.
Right.
And they started to send that money. It went on for 5 years that money was sent to Gaza and was sent to Hamas. Now, officially, Michael, the money was meant to go to poor Palestinians who needed help economically. And you can look back online and through the archives and you'll see pictures of Palestinians lining up and some getting $100 bills, some getting $200 bills. The money was literally brought in the beginning in suitcases with cash. That's how it was brought in. There was a Qatari official, Muhammad al-Amadi. He was the guy who was bringing the money into Gaza. He would come to Israel. He'd stay at these nice hotels here in Jerusalem. He'd get in a car with the suitcases, drive them over to Gaza, cross in, and hand over the money. And then it would be distributed to the Palestinian people. But even if some of that money went to the Palestinian people and went to, people who needed it, let's understand what it did. It opened up other money that Hamas might have had to give to poor Palestinians to keep them afloat. Now they could use that money for terror. They could use it to dig tunnels. They could use it to acquire more weapons. They could use it to produce more weapons. They could use it for training. The Israeli intelligence services came back pretty quickly, I would say, after the first couple of years and said, listen, we know that some of this money is going to terrorism. But at no point did Netanyahu stop it. In 2021, when Naftali Bennett became prime minister, he kept the policy going. When Yair Lapid replaced him for about 5-6 months, he kept the money going. No one at any point stopped the money. And it kept on flowing into Gaza. And look, that's part of this concepcia, this idea that money can buy you quiet.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's fascinating. Let's consider all of that which we just discussed as sort of the general part of this, the conceptia, maybe it's even the failure of analysis. I want to talk about the failure of collection, and maybe that's caused by the failure in analysis. The example I see the most often is Israel at one point decided to quit collecting on handheld Hamas walkie-talkies. But are there better examples of where Israel just decided to quit collecting things, or what are some others?
Israel felt, and this goes back again to technology that we kind of spoke about before, but now looking at it more from the intelligence collection perspective. Israel has very sophisticated SIGINT capabilities, for example. We have a unit called A200, not as big as the NSA, but extremely technological, some of the most advanced capabilities that are out there when it comes to signal intelligence. Israel had the ability, and still has the ability, to listen to every phone conversation inside Gaza, to pretty much intercept any electronic communication that would go on between people in Gaza and outside of the Gaza Strip. It knew what was happening, or it felt that it knew what was happening, and because it could hear what they were saying. So that type of capability gave it this sense of confidence that it understood what Hamas was really planning. What we now know is that Hamas had an off the books or off the grid internal communications network that at some point Israel was able to also tap into that. But then it also thought that it knew what was happening because it had tapped in. But then Hamas knew that Israel was on that network. And then it even went further old school and stopped all types of electronic communication, even on the internal network. But we might not have known that that was happening, that they had picked up on that. And that led to this belief that they were able to tell us things, and we thought we were listening to them on the closed secure network they thought they had, or we thought they didn't know we were on, and of course on the open networks. That's only one example. The other one, which I think is probably more glaring, is human intelligence. When it came to Gaza over the years, Israel had pretty much, I don't want to say the word neglected because that might be a little unfair, but it had shifted its focus away from having human intelligence and cultivating and developing and then, activating human sources on the ground. You have to ask yourself a very simple question, right? And you know this. You got a few thousand people who are getting ready to invade your country. There's not one who has a handler that they can call up on the Israeli side and say, hey, we might be coming or we're coming tomorrow. And there wasn't. There's a unit in the IDF under military intelligence. Everyone knows A200. There's another unit called the 504th unit. It's a unit that its specialty, its whole purpose is to manage, recruit, and protect human assets. Their operations in the years leading up to October 7th had pretty much all been focused on Lebanon, some on Syria, but not at all on Gaza. They did not have a single agent on the ground in Gaza ahead of October 7th.
It's incredible.
Ever since October 7th, that has been a focus that they've now, of course, redeploying in big waves and getting much more into the weeds there on that. And obviously we should. But I think that this has to do with a couple of reasons. One was we were over-reliant on the technology and on the signal intelligence capabilities. But the second thing was, let's remember, when we pulled out of Gaza in 2005, we didn't have boots on the ground there anymore. And while special forces would occasionally go in, it was mostly very, raids, operations, grab someone, or to maintain listening posts and devices that you might have had somewhere on the ground. But it was never to manage or handle these assets that you would have expected Israel to have. And that was a glaring failure and mistake that was made by the Israeli intelligence community.
Yeah. Wow. You mentioned the last 36 hours. It's been written about, but it's absolutely riveting. Talk a little bit about, well, first, I think it's usually described as folks in the army that are female that are up the night before watching and monitoring the cameras, see things happening, actually phone it into their superiors. But I guess the concepcia is so prevalent that it's sort of dismissed. Or to take us through, let's call them the failures to comprehend what they're seeing. What are some of those?
Well, so these female spotters, surveillance soldiers, what we call in Hebrew the tatzpitaniot. These are female soldiers who are deployed at the frontline bases, are watching screens and seeing what's happening on the border. They already in the weeks prior to October 7th had seen increased activity along the border. They had seen training. They had seen more senior Hamas commanders coming to watch the training than had been seen there in the past. And they reported that up to their commanders, and the commanders told them, you don't understand. You're looking very tactically. You're looking at the granular detail. That you don't understand what's really happening. And they were shut down. They tragically paid one of the greatest prices. 15 soldiers from one of the bases were killed. Another 6 were taken hostage to Gaza. One of them was rescued just a couple months into the war in an operation. 5 of them, it took until January of 2025. Almost 700 days that they had spent in Gaza to be brought back in one of the ceasefires. But what happened in the 36 hours leading up was already on Friday. So October 7th was Saturday. On Friday, Israel sees, and one of its intelligence collection systems and signal intelligence, it sees that 100 Israeli SIM cards suddenly go live inside the Gaza Strip. Now, that would mean one of two things. One, that suddenly 100 Israelis are inside Gaza. That's not good. Or two, that Palestinians in Gaza have replaced their SIM cards with Israeli SIM cards. And why would they do that? Only if they plan to cross into Israel and they want to have uninterrupted communication capabilities, because they have a different network over there than we have in Israel. But then when Israel looks back, so that could mean that an attack is happening, and an incursion is on its way. But when Israel looks back, it remembers that a year earlier, they had tested about 30 SIM cards around the same day. That led some of the analysts to say, this must be the annual oil checkup of these SIM cards. That's what it's a drill. They do this around October 6th. That's the day of the SIM card checkup. We now know that they did it this way, also part of deception, to put Israel to sleep. Fast forward to the night, the IDF chief of staff, by the way, for reasons that have to still be investigated, the IDF chief of staff is not given the report about the SIM cards. It does not make its way up to the top echelons of the military or of the Shin Bet. That's the intelligence agency responsible specifically for the Palestinian territories, including Gaza. But then they start to get additional intelligence in the middle of the night. They see, for example, surveillance detects that Hamas is uncovering some of their underground rocket launchers. That would also indicate they're getting ready to fire rockets. But then they intercept a phone call between Islamic Jihad, a top Islamic Jihad operative, and a top Hamas operative. And the Islamic Jihad operative, because remember, the Islamic Jihad's not in the know that this attack is happening, says, are you guys getting ready for an attack against Israel? We're seeing stuff. And they say, no, this is just a drill. That sets off the debate that happens for hours throughout the night. What is Hamas doing? Is it a drill or is it an attack? And if it is an attack, what kind of attack? Because then let's go back to what I said before. We have forces deployed along the border. So even if it is an attack, we'll be able to handle whatever might be coming. Few hours go by, and again, they see another indicator. Hamas is preparing some of the underground bunker systems inside Gaza, some of these tunnel networks for their top commanders, people like Mohammed Def, Yahya Sinwar, the leaders of Hamas, the military wing and the entire Hamas. They start to prepare the descent into these tunnels. Why would they go down into the tunnels? It must be that they are preparing for their attack. They know that Israel will retaliate and they want to be in a safe place deep underground. Or again, is this just more of the same drill that's taking place? And this goes on all throughout the night. The chief of staff is woken up. The head of the Shin Bet leaves his house not far from Tel Aviv, goes to headquarters, actually convenes his division commanders. You got the head of the operations directorate who's on the phone with the chief of staff, the head of the Southern Command, which is the IDF regional command responsible for Gaza, goes down to his base in Beersheba in the Negev. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But they're not making changes to the force deployment on the border. And the reason is because, and the chief of staff pretty much, Herzi Halevi at the time, pretty much says this in one of the conversations, let's make sure that whatever we do, don't let them know that we know. And the reason was because if they now see that we're preparing, two things will happen potentially. If it's a drill, they will now know that we know they're drilling. How did we find out? They'll be able to reverse engineer, uncover our signal intelligence capabilities. So that'll burn intelligence sources. Number two, they might think that we're preparing for war, and then they might actually attack when they weren't planning to attack. The option that they actually are planning to attack was considered, but again, we got troops there. We'll be okay. Put them on a little higher level of alert. Get them a little more prepared, but don't have them man their tanks on the border. Don't move those tanks up into those frontline positions yet. Michael, you talk to people in the Air Force today, and they'll tell you, look, all we had to do, throw 2 Apache helicopters, longbows, up there on the border. The rodders whirring, throwing up some sand. You got the rapid fire cannon under the fuselage. That would have been enough for them to say, whoa, Israel knows we're coming, we're going to stand down, or we're going to do it differently. It was that simple, potentially, to stop what was coming. But all of this was misunderstood, not analyzed correctly, not digested the right way. I mean, to the extent, and we tell the story in the book, that one of the heads of intelligence in the IDF, they had a phone call at, I think it was like 5 o'clock in the morning, and they said, okay, let's reconvene at 6:30. Let's see where things stand. 6:29 was when the attack began.
Oh, man, that reminds me that the Bush National Security Council was going to have a meeting on or about September 11th about terrorism. What is there to say? Well, before I go to what Hamas may have assumed and what they thought would happen, here in the United States, when we have, or we're presumed to have intelligence failures related to not one person in charge, no one who could look across all the stovepipes and make a final judgment, do people in Israel, and by the way, then we created a director of national intelligence, which is controversial and no one's sure that this actually worked, but is there a similar feeling in Israel that all of this information, military, Mossad, especially your internal domestic service, coming up to one individual who would have made a better call or could have seen it all, maybe sounded the alarm earlier?
I wish there was more of a conversation about this. Unfortunately, there's not. I mean, if you look at the structure right now of Israel's intelligence community, we don't have the dozens of intelligence agencies that you have in the United States that might warrant the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. But what we do have is a very segregated intelligence community in the sense of responsibility. So in the IDF falls under the purview of the defense minister. And military intelligence, which is the larger of the three intelligence agencies, is a general in uniform, reports to the chief of staff and reports to the defense minister. The prime minister is the person who is responsible for the Mossad, which is our equivalent of the CIA, our overseas foreign operating intelligence agency, and the Shin Bet, which is the domestic one, the one focused on Palestinian terrorism. So he appoints people there. He's in charge of approving their operations, not the defense minister. What this leads to occasionally, and I've seen this happen over the years, is it leads to sometimes tension between not only the intelligence chiefs, but also between, of course, the prime minister and the defense minister. In Israel, we have a different system of government than you have in the United States. So you could have a reality where the defense minister is a member of a different party than the prime minister. The prime minister could be Netanyahu, the head of Likud, and the defense minister could be someone who's from a completely different party. We had, for example, Ehud Barak, another former prime minister. Barak and Bibi had fought against each other as politicians. Now one is prime minister, one is defense minister. Now, if you want to get, for example, the defense minister wants the head of the Mossad to come to a meeting in his office, he has to ask for permission from the prime minister. Now, let's say the prime minister and the defense minister are not getting along that particular week. They're fighting about something political. There have been cases over the years in Israel that the prime minister has refused to allow the head of the Mossad or the head of the Shin Bet to go to that meeting in the defense minister's office. That's absurd. Now, this is not what happened in the lead up to October 7th, but you do understand that the kind of demarcation of the lines and the rules of how these different agencies operate has a built-in tension in between the organizations and their leadership that creates a problem. I would want to see one direct, clear hierarchy and structure that will then lead to a more synchronized collaboration between the different operations, between the different agencies, not only on who's responsible for what, but when things are collected and when there is intelligence, when it comes to analysis, for example, a better flow between everyone to understand and to analyze.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be something big that comes out of your eventual inquiry. All right, we're beginning to wrap up here, but I think it'd be interesting to ask you a little bit about some of Hamas's assumptions or motivation for the attack, and did they make any bad calls? So, of course, I think, one, Sinwar hoped Hezbollah would get in and maybe that Iran would unleash all of the proxies against Israel simultaneously. So that seems to me like a bad assumption. Also, could you also address this? Did Sinwar also do this to disrupt normalization because he felt like the Arab states didn't care so much about the Palestinians anymore? Or is that just something we've invented here in the West because we're mistaking everything or looking at it through this prism of normalization is the new trend in the Middle East?
Well, I think there were three, from what I understand from the Israeli authorities. And again, Sinwar is not with us to be able to ask him, but he did write things. And Israeli intelligence has gotten their hands on some of those documents over the last 2 years inside Gaza. There were three main motivations, it seems, for this attack by Hamas. First of all, and this always has to be said, a genocidal jihadist terrorist group never needs a reason, to attack Israel and want to kill Israeli Jews in particular. That's just called another Monday at the office, right? This is what they exist for, and this is what they try to do. Did they actually believe that they would be able to destroy Israel? I don't think they actually believed that they would be able to destroy Israel, but they did believe, and this ties in to what you mentioned, Michael, they thought that Hezbollah would immediately join. They thought that Iran would immediately join. And they felt that if Israel is under attack from three different fronts all at the same time, would that mean the elimination of the state of Israel? Probably not. But it would be a blow, the likes of which Israel would have extreme difficulty from recovering from. October 7th was bad enough. Imagine Hezbollah had crossed in that morning from the north. And by the way, just open parentheses for a moment. One of the biggest question marks that a lot of people have, and I still have questions about, what took so long for the IDF to get down to the border and to start to fight back? And one of the reasons that it did take time was because while the attack began, and it took time to understand what the attack was and where it was coming from and how big it was, etc. But a couple hours in, they already knew what was going on. But then they had to ask themselves a question. If we send everyone down south, what happens to the north? What if this is just the beginning and Hezbollah now is about to come across the border? Who will be there to stop them? So they had to wait also to understand what was going on in the north with Hezbollah. So Sinwar definitely thought Hezbollah would join right away. Iran would join right away. Hezbollah joined the following morning, as you remember, right, but with limited rockets just to the northern area, nothing to the center of the country, no attempts to infiltrate into Israel. Thankfully, that was torpedoed and thwarted, and it was a decision also by Nasrallah not to go down that route. But that was reason one.
Let me see let's get back to this, but raises an important question. One, I want to know, why didn't Hezbollah get involved? But also, have you discovered that Hamas definitely briefed Iran prior to October 7th on the actual nature? Well, same with Hezbollah. Did a Hamas envoy go to each of these two entities and say, we're doing this, here's the scale, and here's the date?
Khalil al-Khaya, who is now the current leader of Hamas, who is based in Doha. He is the guy that Israel tried to eliminate in the Doha strike. I think it was on September 9th of this year. And it was a failed strike. His son was actually killed in that strike against the Hamas compound in Doha, in Qatar. He was the guy who was going around the region, and he was meeting in Iran, and he was meeting in Beirut, and he was telling them about this idea that we all attack at the same time. There was never, apparently, from my understanding from the Israelis, they did not discuss a specific date. What was discussed was a time frame of when it would happen. It seems to some extent, and again, it's as you know, in the intelligence world, it's easy to try to put yourself inside Sinwar's head, but you don't really know. But it seems that Sinwar might have gotten a little trigger happy, wanted to jump the gun, wanted to be the first, was confident that they would join right away. They didn't, and they obviously had their reasons not to. We could talk about that in a moment. But he thought that they would, and he thought that if he starts, he'll be the bigger hero. I led the resistance. I was the guy who led this campaign, not Iran, not Hezbollah, me, the leader of Hamas, imprisoned, as he would say figuratively, inside the Gaza Strip. He wanted that credit. He wanted that kind of halo around him. It didn't work out the way that he thought it would, because Hezbollah was taken by surprise, was not prepared for an attack, did not attack that morning. When it did, it was more out of a show of solidarity with Hamas, but nothing in the way they were very calculated in what they did. Remember, they only fired rockets into the north, nowhere into the center of the country. By that point, Israel had already beefed up its forces in the north. My own brother called up an emergency call-up order on October 7th. By 10:30 a.m., he was already on the Lebanese border with his unit in the reserves. Wow. So Israel floods that border with thousands, tens of thousands at some point of reservists. And Iran also held back from firing its own missiles. There was a lot that was also going on behind the scenes already at this point, already on October 7th, messaging and signaling by the Biden administration to the Iranians, don't you dare get involved here. So I think that they were a bit taken by surprise. Would they have joined a big operation and a big attack had it actually been planned out to the exact date and time? I don't know. And it seems that that's something that we'll never fully know the extent of. But that was definitely one of his reasons. The other reason, which I've heard this from enough of the Israelis, and it seems that he, in his writings also that have been discovered, he does insinuate this. He didn't want to try to block the Saudi normalization. Now, it wasn't that he was against Saudi normalization per se, specifically, but the Palestinian issue was being completely thrown to the side. No one cared about the Palestinians anymore. The Abraham Accords, the Emiratis were already working with the Israelis, Bahrain, Morocco, there's peace with Jordan already, there's peace with Egypt, Abu Mazen, nothing's moving, no one cares about them anymore. And now if Saudi Arabia normalizes, and you remember this, Michael, I mean, we were close before October 7th, right? It was looked like it was going to happen. That would have maybe been the last nail in the coffin of the Palestinian issue. And he wanted to bring it back to the forefront. And by the way, he succeeded in a huge,
he sure did.
Huge way. I mean, when you look at the world today, this has become the rallying cry of every young person around the world, pretty much. Every college campus, every big movement, the Palestinian issue is up there. Not to mention the fact that France and Belgium and Canada and Australia and the United Kingdom have all already recognized a Palestinian state, right? They did this while Hamas was still holding hostages in Gaza. So did Sinwar make a mistake? Was he wrong on that front? I would say, you know what? He was probably right. I mean, today, everybody knows Gaza. Everybody cares now about the Palestinians once again. He probably gambled correctly in that sense.
Incredible. Do you think Iran was excited that they did this on October 7th?
I think Iran was excited. And I think that they were completely miscalculating as well. They thought that they thought two things. They thought, number one, Israel's bogged down with Gaza and then eventually with Lebanon when the ground offensive began there. There's no way that Israel will ever be able to launch an attack against Iran. They also thought that even if Israel wanted to, America would eventually would put the brakes on that. I think that their greatest strategic surprise was underestimating what the Trump administration would eventually not only kind of give a green light to the Israeli attack that began on June 13th of this year, but even eventually joining it with the B-2 bombers. That was something that the Iranians never saw coming. And they thought that they had that immunity. They were wrong in a big way. Thankfully, they were wrong.
All right, last question. This has been just amazing. So Hezbollah is caught by surprise the morning of October 7th. Did they want to get involved, or did they call Tehran and Tehran say, no, we need you there as a deterrent force against Israel eventually bombing Iran's nuclear program? Or, how did that all go down? Did they start talking immediately that morning about whether Hezbollah should do something beyond a symbolic volley of rockets?
So Hezbollah and Iran are obviously intricately connected and linked with one another and very, very and tied very closely. As close as they are tied, Hezbollah does have its own interests when it comes to its own of motivations of what it wants to do. And already even before October 7th, I was hearing from people in the IDF That's something that we had long assumed, or I had assumed, and it seemed to be the conventional thinking, that the moment that Israel would ever to attack Iran, Hezbollah would immediately light up the northern border. That was not believed anymore to be scientific. It could be that, yes, Israel would attack Iran and Hezbollah would sit on the sidelines. By the way, that is eventually what happened in June, although Hezbollah had been weakened at that point and had good reason to sit that out, but it did not get involved when Israel had attacked Iran. But that did prove the point. Iran and Hezbollah did speak in the immediate aftermath. But what seems to have happened is that Hezbollah said, okay, we're not going to go in. What Iran might have told them, I do not know. And if they told them you should go in a big way, it seems that they did not tell them that because they wanted to hold on to Hezbollah for themselves and to be this continued deterrent against Israel, which is what its whole purpose was, to deter Israel from ever attacking Iran and its nuclear facilities. But what Hezbollah had to do was to show solidarity. It couldn't leave the Palestinians and the Gaza and Hamas on its own. But what it did was not significant. It was something that Israel was able to say, okay, if those are the rules of the game, we can manage. And it was very controversial, but Israel pulled out its people from the north. It evacuated a lot of those towns. About 50, 60,000 people were pulled away from the northern border, from kibbutzim and towns and villages throughout the north, redeployed into the center of the country, into Jerusalem, into other places, into hotels and other places for a long several months until the ground offensive began. Obviously, there was the pager attack. Things escalated come September. And then in November, we got the ceasefire at the end of November of last year, with Hezbollah significantly degraded and weakened. And even, I could tell you that just today I was talking with a intelligence officer who had been working on the Hezbollah desk during that period. Hezbollah has been hurt in a way that they never imagined was possible. In Iran, let's also remember another thing. Pre-October 7th, Hezbollah was the greatest success story in the terrorist world, right? Americans have focused always less on Hezbollah because it's not, it's done a lot against America. It was involved in the 1983 Marine barracks bombing, killed a couple hundred American Marines. It has kidnapped and murdered a CIA station chief and other people over the years. But it was Al-Qaeda, Iraq, other countries, Afghanistan, Taliban, much more in the U.S. focus. Hezbollah was the greatest success of Iran. They had succeeded in exporting the revolution. They had literally, if not in a formal way, but they had literally taken over the country of Lebanon. They were an amazing military power in its capabilities. And it was the model that they were trying to replicate all over the region. They wanted to do that in Gaza, this time, though, with Sunnis. They've been trying to do that with the Houthis in Yemen. They tried to do that with Assad, who was one of their allies in Syria. They've been doing this in Iraq, right? They have Hezbollah forces in other places. This was really their great success story. And they have been hurt and decimated, not completely destroyed. I don't want to jump ahead, but they have been hurt in a way that I think Hezbollah never imagined was possible and Iran never imagined was possible.
Yaakov, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Everyone should order While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. Thank you for joining NatSec Matters.
Thank you very much, Michael.
That was Yaakov Katz. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoyed listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.